To paraphrase what Tommy Douglas said, one of the creationists of the welfare state, he drew an analogy to a cream churner to represent the world's economies. So the people who churned the cream, the people who put in the milk, and the people who turned the handle were the poor. The rich were the ones putting their mouths over the cream pipe and drinking all the cream. On side proposition, we say that this is a rigged system. And not only do we want to change the system, we want to break the system. We're very proud to propose. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. Give you a model, a 3-point model, then we go into 3 pieces of substantive material. I want to first talk to you about the principle of reciprocity and why that necessitates us to not tax the poor. Second of all, I want to talk to you about systemic oppression and how that has historically hurt the poor. And third off, I want to talk to you about how this benefits the poor. My partner is going to talk to you about, in a second speech, our final piece of constructive material, that is to say, how this benefits the economy as a whole. But first, what is our case stance? We think on side government that the greatest societies, and we envision that the greatest societies are those that have a successful poor and a prospering poor. Let's begin with our model. 3 points here. First off, we would say that, like, the model of this resolution would be that we wouldn't give any income tax and we wouldn't tax any income for people who make the same or less than the minimum standard of living in that country, right? The aggregate standard of living within that country. That's our first point. Second of all other taxes will apply, right? So things like sales tax, things like luxury tax, things like property tax will still apply to the poor. No thanks. Third of all, we can still support social services and all other kinds of infrastructure building on our side of the house. Because recognize, and we're going to prove to you in this debate, why there's no trade-off between not taxing the poor and social services. That is to say, America spends 50% of their GDP on the military. We think it can allocate 5% of that to spending on social services. No thanks. Let's begin with the principle of reciprocity. Because recognize, no thanks, that you give back directly proportional to what you gain from society. That is to say, and that is why we have a progressional taxation system. Because the rich have benefited from society through the poor paying them through the lottery of birth, which is morally arbitrary. That's why they get taxed the most. We're going to prove to you, not only has the poor not benefited from society, but they've been actively harmed. 4 structural reasons as to why and why in principle we shouldn't tax them. Number 1, systemic oppression, right? That is to say, the government making sure that all the tax money goes to bailouts and subsidies for large companies like Cisco, right? Second of all, the rich have the most power. When a government is comprised of primarily politicians that have some background in business, when they are mostly poor and when they are mostly rich, in and of itself, they are self-interested for their own good. Third off, it's a police state, right? That is to say, a state that makes it and that increases prosecution and persecution rates for the poor because of the certain backgrounds that they come in. For example, in America, the lower socioeconomic classes, normally being Latinos or African Americans, get prosecuted more. It's because of a police state. Number four, they are not politically enfranchised, right? That is to say, they don't go out and turn out the vote because they aren't politically enfranchised. There's no political will. That, in principle, means that they have actively been harmed by society, by the same government that they say would protect them. We think that, in principle, means that and the principle of reciprocity means that we have to not let the poor pay taxes. Go ahead.
How do you solve any of this? By proposing a model that's essentially status quo? Because when you live below the breadline, you don't
No,
get taxed.
that's absolutely wrong. In Canada, $5,000, the bracket of $5,000 and under is when you don't have to pay tax. The standard of living in Canada is $22,000. That's a $17,000 difference. Forgive my math. Second point: systemic oppression hurts the poor, right? Because recognize that the government takes this tax money and it doesn't spend it on the poor, right? And this is probably what opposition is going to say, that maybe they're going to spend on social services. They're going to give back to the poor. I'm going to give you systemic reasons as to why they won't spend back on the poor. First off, because they're not politically enfranchised. Second off, and this is very important, because no one cares, right? There isn't any political will in Congress or in legislation to cater to the poor because they aren't politically enfranchised. Third off, these politicians are self-interested, right? When they get thousands of dollars and millions of dollars from super PACs from the companies that they give subsidies for, that's the exact incentive for them to get reelected. I'll give you some examples. First off, The USA spends 50% of their GDP on military. They only spend 5% of that GDP on social services like building roads, on building schools. Given that, we think that the tax money that these poor are going to be given is spent directly, disproportionately on the rich, right? So I'm going to give you some examples. For example, Cisco, right, the international networking company, was given huge subsidies by large international governments, but what happened is that during the time that they were given these subsidies, the amount of dividends that were given to the stakeholders of Cisco rise exponentially, right? This means that they are given that subsidies to their stakeholders. We don't think that's principally just, and we don't think that's practically good either. Let's talk about why we fix it when we exempt taxing from the poor. Because now they get that money to themselves, right? Now they don't have to give it to executives in Exxon. In Exxon, they don't have to give it to executives in GM. Now they get to keep that money for themselves to do the things that they want with it, and that's going to be my third point. No thanks. What are the impacts? Two impacts. First off, you destroy the cycle of poverty, right? That is to say, there are children in Harlem right now who who don't have enough to feed themselves, which means that they get C's and D's on their report card. That inevitably leads to a structural barrier of entry of education, right? At the point where they can feed themselves, at the point where they can buy textbooks, that's when we actually help the most disenfranchised, the most poor people, because now they get an education, because now they can go to college, now they can get an actual job and not work at places that exploit them, right? We think that's beneficial. Second of all, it helps with social mobility, right? That is to say, when you have more money to spend, you can spend that money on yourself, which means you can be lifted to the upper class, to the middle class, right? Reference the Lorenz curve. Let's begin with why this benefits the poor. Two sub-points here. First off, I want to talk to you about allocative efficiency and why the poor know how to spend the money better. Because recognize that the things that the government and the things that they're probably proposing are things like social services, right? There are things like better roads. We say that the poor would rather spend that money on food and necessities that they need for their children rather than the infrastructure and maybe slightly better roads in their communities, right? Because the trade-off and the comparative in this debate is whether or not we want to keep these people literally alive, we want to keep them from starving, or rather or not we get a little bit more marginal benefit on their side of the house with social services, which we think we can mitigate very easily, right? By saying things like we can allocate some of that military spending and put it into those social services that these guys are probably going to stand for. We think that's mitigated. We think that, in effect, the government spends more on social services. We think food is a better necessity for the poor to spend on. Second of all, the value of money, right? Which demographic actually needs the money most? Is it the rich or the poor, right? The rich don't need it because they have so much of it, right? Because all they're going to do with excessive money is the comparative between a Gucci bag and a Louis Vuitton bag. On the comparative, the difference and the comparative for the poor is literally whether they will starve to death or whether or not they can get the adequate amount of food for their family. That's the trade-off in this debate. We would rather prefer the poor because they are the most marginalized, because they need that money the most, because they only earn $20,000 a year at most, right? On government team, we stand and we envision a society that has a successful poor, that has a poor that can get out of the slums when they actually need it, a poor that has the ability to get out of these slums, and that's why we won't tax the poor. We're very proud to propose.
Okay. In that case, I will now invite the first speaker of the opposition to open their case.
Ladies and gentlemen, this debate needs to be brought back into the real world, right? A world where there's not only just one singular definition of what exactly is acceptable as the people who are poor, right? A world where side proposition actually fulfills their burden as the proposition, right? Who are debating under a change motion, right? A world where the opposition are actually standing for the what's right for the people and how to empower the people, not a proposition who have completely just misinterpreted what this whole entire debate is supposed to be about, right? Now, as the first speaker of the proposition, we'll be dealing with the one main banner of proving the necessity and the efficacy of this motion, right? And my second speaker will be dealing with how this motion is I'll actually be dealing with the necessity and the efficacy of taxing the poor, right? My second speaker will be dealing with how not taxing the poor is a very illegitimate principle to uphold, right? Especially for a government who stands for the people, right? But before I go into that, there are just a few points of refutation that I'd like to highlight to the House, right? Now, under this, I'll be doing this on the basis of two main things, right? Contextual clash and a strategic clash, right? And a strategic clash, right? Now, in terms of the contextual clash, right, where we hear from the opposition that first of all the system that we are currently living in is a rigged system, right? We tell you that that's not true in context of this debate in status quo, right? We tell you that this system is not rigged, right? We tell you that the rigged system that they're actually trying to deviate from, right, is a past system, and we tell you that status quo is working to fix that past system as it is already, and I will be further proving that in my contextual points, right? Now the second thing we have to look at is where they tell us now the second thing that we need to look at, right, is where they set their context and they base their argument on the current situations of Canada, right? We find that very problematic because we tell you that the world doesn't live in Canada, especially when a majority of all the examples, right, of all the examples come from America, right? We tell you that that's a state that we need to focus on and how their problems don't exactly address that state, right? And then the next when we look the next thing the next aspect that we need to look at is the strategical clash, where we tell you that they basically that there are two main areas, right? There are two main areas that we've identified in the proposition's case, right? Where they tell us, no, thank you, right? Where they tell us, right, that their mechanism or their system, right, will be dealing with their mechanism is to implement where people who don't earn enough to pay tax don't pay tax, right? We find that very problematic when that's exactly what status quo is today, right? That's what status quo does. That's the pay as you earn system. That is something that status quo implements, right? We tell you it's very problematic when the proposition cannot fulfill their burden as the proposition to debate under a changed motion, right? Then the next thing that we tell them in their strategy, right, is where they tell us about how their model will be stopping the government from disenfranchising the poor, right? But we tell you then is that government already has that obligation in status quo, right? And we tell you that the fault of we tell you that it's not a fault of the government for disenfranchising the and we also tell you that it's not a fault of where we tell you that it's not exactly, and it's not a fault of like society when the government disenfranchises the poor, right? We tell you that's not a fault of government, right? We tell you that the fault of government is them not properly providing for the citizens who are in need, right? What we tell you is that, however, and we also cannot fault government. Oh, no, sorry. We tell you that it's the fault of government for disenfranchising the poor, right? It's the fault of government for not providing for their citizens, right? However, it's not the fault of government to allow these citizens to pay tax, right? To pay tax, right? because when these citizens pay tax, they actually have a stake in society. They can actually be a part of that society. They can actually help themselves, right? Look at the last. When we look at the last thing in terms of their context and their strategical area, right? We look at how their standard of living. When we look back to the whole Canada, how they're setting the motion in Canada. No, thank you. Right? We tell you that the standard of living in Canada, right, is based off of the middle and upper classes of people who live in Canada, right? Tell you that's a majority. That's why the standard of living is so high, right? We tell you that a minority of the people who live in Canada are actually lower class, are actually poor, right? We tell you those people are not poor. However, this debate needs to focus on countries where there are actually a majority of poor people living in those countries, because those countries do exist, right? Your model does not help the people in those countries because it's only focusing on Canada, right? Now moving on, right? No, thank you. Now moving on to massive standards, but before that, no, thank you. Right. Two things in context that we need to establish. First of all, how the tax system currently works, right? And secondly, who exactly is this debate about? Look at the first idea of how the tax system actually works. We need to identify what is tax in the current taxing system. We tell you that first of all, we have two main tax systems. We tell you we have the pay-as-you-earn tax system, and we have the provisional tax system, right? So the pay-as-you-earn tax system, which is a current status quo, which is something that they are standing for as a proposition, right? Is where people who have enough money to pay tax do pay tax, and the people who don't, those people are like below the breadline, don't have to pay tax, right? And the provisional tax, right, is for those people who have an overly large amount of like income, right? So those people have to naturally provide more tax, right? So now we need to look at where does this tax money go. We tell you that this tax money goes to infrastructure. We tell you that this tax money goes to community improvement, right? We also tell you that the tax money goes to like welfare services, right, or grants, or like subsidies, right, government benefits, right, for the disempowered, right? No, thank you. Now look at the second point of context is like who are we actually talking about? Where we need to realize that there are numerous two branches of poor, right? We tell you that there are poor people who are lower than middle class, right? But they're still above the breadline, right? We tell you that those people are recognized as citizens and tax-paying citizens, right? Because even though they actually have
Last chance.
no, thank you. Oh wait, thank you. Yes.
How can you say that we only bring Canada examples when South Africa has worse income inequality right now than it used to have in apartheid?
That's the point, right? The basis of your argument is for Canada, right? A company where there's more upper class people than what they are more upper class and middle class people than what they are actually people who live in the lowest classes, right? So now moving on to my positive matter, where we need to look at why exactly is the tax system necessary, right? We tell you one thing, right? We tell you that the tax system is essential for general economies, right? We tell that the reason being, right, is that the tax system, right, increases the money flowing within the economy, right? Therefore empowering the economy, right? Because there's money flowing in the economy, that means money can flow out of the economy, like trade and all of that stuff, right? Now you need to look at specifics as what does it actually do for the people, right? Well, I've already told you in context that the tax system allows the government to build roads, make work programs, right? We tell you that the government is able to the tax system is able to spearhead community programs, right? We have built parks and houses, right? We tell you that reaches people on the ground because these infrastructural systems are both for the people on the ground, the people who use the ground, and for the people who cannot actually gain access to this.
Here.
I will now invite the second speaker for the proposition to continue with the government's case.
Honorable panel, we live in a society that unproportionately and unfairly helps the rich and that hurts the poor directly. We live in a society where the poor are marginalized, where the system works against the poor, and where the system works only for the rich and powerful. We are against that system, and we think that at the point when society takes away more from the poor than it does give back to them, then the poor should be protected, and that the society should stop stealing their money from them in taxes. Today, I'm going to first refute everything that they have said on their side, rebuild my partner's arguments, which are very much untouched, and then I'm going to go into a new point about how this benefits the economy as a whole under this resolution. So let me get into some refutation for everything we heard on their side. But first, I want to clarify something very, very important, because what they tell us right at the beginning of their first speech is that we need to get real. And we think it's them that need to get real, because they don't understand how economic systems and how taxation systems work around the world. We think they understand maybe how it works in South Africa, but what we don't think is that even in South Africa, whether they understand whether their current system, no thank you, is actually effective at helping the poor. And because my partner brings that up in a POI. So let me tell you how it works around the world. In the vast majority of countries around the world, taxes work in there's a huge gap in between the welfare that people receive and the aggregate standard of living and the minimum standard of living. The way it works around the world is that there's a huge gap in the amount of people that are eligible for welfare and the amount of people that live below the aggregate standard of living. But we have more responses to this, because they tell us the status quo already benefits those below the minimum standard of living. I already told you why that's not true in the majority of cases. Now let me tell you why it's not true, even in South Africa, where they tell us about it. First of all, I bring up my partner's POI, because my partner's POI, they just dodged around it when they tried to talk about Canada. They don't address the situation in South Africa. So I want to address that first, then I'm going to address the situation in Canada. In South Africa, income inequality is worse than it was under apartheid. We think that the reason because of that is that even though white people are not the only ones that hold power, the people that hold power today are still the rich and still the powerful. We tell you that if you look at where we get money from, or who makes decisions, who makes infrastructure decisions, it's the rich and powerful. My partner gave you great analysis on how the rich and powerful are self-interested, how they don't care about the poor, how the poor's votes don't matter, and how just the conventional methods of trying to get change completely alienate the poor and don't let the poor help themselves. We need to change that radically. So then the next thing they tell us is that about a tax system that pay as you earn, also known as proportional taxation. That is what we're defending today. We're defending a system where if people don't make enough money to live, they shouldn't be paying for an overly large military. We're defending a system where first priority goes to the basic standard of living, and then we can talk about giving back monetarily to the rest of society. But my point will also talk about how indirectly this resolution benefits the society as a whole. And then they tell us that poor are, and then they give us the example of Canada. So I want to address that too, because they tell us that poor are the minority in Canada. First of all, we think that's not true. We think that the poor are the oppressed, poor are the marginalized. We think that actually the rich and powerful are not true, are not the majority. And if you look at it at a global scale, if the top 1% rich around the world control more than 50% of the world's population, we say that the richest people are the minority, and yet that minority is the most powerful and richest minority around the world, which then goes and oppresses all of the other people around the world, and especially the extremely rich. No, thank you. Okay, I want to refute what they tell us about how money goes to welfare when you don't tax it when you tax the poor, and so it helps them still. We have a couple of responses. First of all, we think welfare is inadequate. But second of all, we think it's completely inefficient to then tax the poor and then use the excuse that you're giving it to more poor in welfare. We think that's completely inefficient. Second thing I want to respond to is when they talk about how infrastructure benefits everyone. Because we have three responses. The first is that giving the money is directly much more effective and much more helpful for the poor. It's not helpful for a poor person for us to build a highway if the poor person can't afford a car. It's not helpful for us to build public transport if a poor person can't afford a ticket. Give them the money to afford that ticket, then invest in your infrastructure. That's what we stand for today. We're not against infrastructure. We are for giving the poor money first. Now, I'd like to get into my constructive today about how we benefit the society and the economy as a whole under our side of the house. So we think that the major way that when we talk about taxes and reducing taxes, and when we talk about giving money and subsidies, we're talking about economic stimulus. So what I want to talk to you about is what is a more efficient way of using economic stimulus and of creating economic stimulus. So let me tell you about it. So the purpose of economic system and the way that it works under their side of the house and in the status quo is about trickle-down economics. They believe that if you subsidize rich companies, by the way, rich companies that are controlled by very powerful and very unequally rich CEOs who take a lot of the money, they believe that that's going to go and help the rest of the system. It's going to trickle down, it's going to multiply, and it's going to help the rest of the economy. Why is that not true? My partner gave you a couple of great examples. I want to even add about how the system works against people. He gives you examples about systematic oppression, and all they do to refute it actually is that they just assert that the system is not rigged. So I want to add two examples. First of all, on my partner's example of education and who makes we ask you two questions. Whose fault is it that education is such a necessity in the current world? The reason it's a necessity is because the rich people who control the hiring process, who control the job market, demand high standards of education. No, thank you. And it's because the rich people also make tuition fees extremely expensive. Second of all, I want to give you an impact of climate change and how climate change has been called by rich people who don't care about environmental refugees. It's about the rich people who control oil companies, who control manufacturing companies that pollute, not caring about the rest of the people. Those are just two more ways the system oppresses people. We tell you that just stimulating the companies that are just going to take that stimulus and pay more in dividends to their shareholders doesn't work. But I also want to address infrastructure because we believe that infrastructure investments and infrastructure stimulus still unproportionately benefits rich people rather than poor. Why is that? Well, we look at the companies that actually get the contracts for infrastructure investments because governments work on such a way that they take the lowest bidder. So we ask you, who can afford to be the lowest bidder? We tell you that's the rich companies who are so big and so powerful that they have economies of scale behind them that they're able to lower their prices. And we tell you it's again the rich companies and the rich owners of those companies that are benefiting. It's the rich shareholders, it's not the poor. Infrastructure just unproportionately benefits the rich and does the poor. And so our second way, so why is this more efficient on our side of the house? We tell you that poor people, if they don't make enough money, the minimum amount of money to survive, then they're going to spend every penny of money that they get and every penny of money that they save in taxes to just get the basic necessities of life. If it's to actually have internet in their home, or whether it's to actually have electricity in their home, or whether it's to actually have a home, or have money, or have clothes, we tell you all those things are things that poor people will spend every penny on, rather than rich companies who will just pay it out in dividends to shareholders. Shareholders who will not contribute to the society and to the economy as a whole either, because they're just going to let it sit in their bank accounts, sit in stocks, collecting for their lifetime, for their children's lifetime, for their grandchildren's lifetime, instead of investing in the economy. There's only so much that a rich person can spend, and there's a lot that the poor people need to spend money on. We think that by giving the poor the money that they need, the money that they need to survive, we benefit them and we benefit the economy, and that's what makes societies great. That's what we're proud to propose. Thank you.
I will now invite the second speaker of the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am so insulted by side proposition that actually has these ideals that exist around the status quo. What we tell you here is that the current status quo already as it is, already subsidizes individuals that are lower than the breadline, right? We tell you that side proposition's mechanism is actually no different to the kind of status quo that we actually have currently, right? So we tell you that when they actually take us to the history, right, we tell you that we have actually evolutionized from that instance where we actually find the status quo, which is something that they actually need to interact with, right? That's why we tell you in this debate that we need to recognize how social interactions, especially between people, social standards, and government, how they work in this instance, right? We need to actually understand the relationship and the dependency in that cycle in order to improve life in this instance. Ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that the very poor people are the kind of individuals that have very little social capital to even buy bread. We tell you that when such things actually do happen, those people actually find it very difficult to actually support themselves in that instance. We tell you that this idea that when they keep the money, they will be able to actually benefit themselves is actually an idealistic view. But what happens when these people actually work hand in hand with government here, right? What we tell you here, that the government actually gains a large capital system here that is able to actually subsidize these individuals, right? And I'll show you exactly how this actually works. So in this debate, I'll be dealing with my point where I'll be doing mechanistic analysis as to who exactly benefits society in this instance, right? But before I actually get into this, right, I would like to deal with a couple of points that I actually got from side proposition's ideals, right? So under the point of benefits, what they tell us here is that, well, when we actually do not tax these individuals, right, the poor can actually buy food, clothes, rather than paying for anything else, right? In response, what we tell you here is that this is actually a logical flow, right? So what we tell you here is that a basic economy is dependent on the amount of money that government gets, right? So what happens when we actually have a good economy? When we have a good economy, that means that the prices go low, then they can be able to afford those kind of things. But what happens when we actually do not boost the economy and we take away the very revenue that stabilizes the economy in this debate? What we tell you then is that government is forced to actually raise those rates in order to actually stabilize the economy. As a result, what happens here is that the very poor people are actually placed in an instance where it's almost impossible for them to even buy that very bread that they actually have to live by, that they have to actually buy those very clothes that they actually can't do that because of the enormous rates that are actually imposed for the need of the economy to actually maintain that life, right? So what they tell you here, moreover, that the social capital there is so narrow, right? But when we have the government and the social working together, social community working together, we stand a chance of actually benefiting society more. And then they sell us this idea, right, of average individuals who actually pay taxes. Responses, right? What we tell you here is that not all countries are like Canada, America, and all those countries that can actually identify an average land, right? We're telling you about countries like Nigeria, like South Africa, right, like Zimbabwe, right, who hardly even have an average land in that instance. Most of the individuals, right, that are at average are most of the people who are actually stricken under that very same breadline. So we tell you here that their very mechanism does not solve that problem simply because they let people just live in that instance, right? We tell you that in those countries, it will be almost impossible for them to actually implement that. But actually, it's so insulting for them to actually have this idea that in South Africa, right, the economy, right, and the amount of rates that are actually given are so unproportionate, and that the government is also corrupt to such an extent that it actually marginalizes people. Mind you here that South Africa is one of the first countries that actually gives out so many grants for children in society just so that they can be able to actually support children. But moreover, right, we tell you that South Africa actually gives out RDP houses to people in society, right, because of these taxes that they actually do pay. But moreover, right, we tell you about welfare instances and necessities that are actually given to people, right, that are actually benefit society. But let's actually come to this business ideal where they tell us here that, well, businesses actually take money away from these individuals. We tell you in the very same South Africa, we have a social responsibility contract which is identified as the corporate social responsibilities, where companies are actually obligated to give a certain percentage back to the society in that instance. We feel that when your government is corrupt, it is not the problem of taxes, but rather it is the problem of the system that you actually have to fix. We tell you here that that proposition haven't told us that while all these problems that exist in the system are solely dependent on the fact that, well, we pay taxes. We tell you that in a corrupt system, right, there are many other ranges of problems that actually could exist in that cycle. And for that reason, right, you can actually solve those problems, but they haven't proven to us as to why tax and solely tax is actually the enormous reason as to why we have these kind of systems in the first place, right? So they're not really solving anything in this instance. Ladies and gentlemen, the system is flawed, and thus they have to fix that. And South Africa has done that simply because we actually give back to the people in this instance. We tell you that businesses actually have contracts where they actually have to give back to the people. But moreover, let's look at my mechanism here, right? No, thank you. When we tell you that in the side propositions case here, right, that one, it does not allow for equality in society on the basis of financial contribution, right? So when we tell you here that government like South Africa, which you have this ideal that does not give to people, actually is denied this obligation to actually give to its people, especially if the very same revenue that they depend on that should be used to give that to the people is actually taken away because of these ideals, right? So when we tell you here that when money is generated, the people have power over that money. So let's look at the current situation as to what happens when government does not deliver, right? So what we think here is that when government does not deliver, people have the power to actually voice out their opinions and stand against government and demand those services. But what happens when we don't pay tax, especially for the poorer majorities, and we have a defaulted system like they say that we have? We tell you then that the poor people are actually silent because they do not have the power to actually be able to actually voice out those opinions in that instance. We tell you then that you're actually taking the very, very same stability, the very, very same mechanism that allows these individuals to actually stand up to government, to allow them to be able to actually get these services in a defaulted system, like you say. So we tell you that the people in, I'll take you now, we tell you that the people in South Africa are able to actually provide for these individuals simply because of the kind of things that, simply because of the money that they actually get here. But the second disadvantage under the mechanism that we actually get is that it actually proposes an economical pressure on the government here, right? So what we tell you here is that there's something called a social responsibility contract, right? Where people and government actually have to work together, right? So regardless of where you actually are in the bracket, right, we tell you that you have a responsibility to give to the government in order to get back. We tell you that for the very reason that South African government is giving to the people is because the people are actually paying some sort of tax, and there is a relationship formed between the two, right? But moreover, what happens when you actually decrease this? We tell you here that the mechanism that side proposition actually proposes, one, decreases the amount of revenue that government gets, right? That's causing government not being able to actually deliver, right? So, but for example here, we tell you that when the poor people actually give to government taxes here, right? We tell you here that things like clinics and recreation centers are actually given. Ladies and gentlemen, when we have a proposition that says food is more important than your environment, we tell you that this is not true, because with our mechanism, we can achieve both those things, where we make an environment better and we give you food.
They did propose that here.
Right. I will now invite the third speaker from the proposition to continue the government case.
Can I start when I'm ready? Gandhi once said, "The greatness of a nation is determined by its treatment of the most marginalized in that nation." And in the majority of the nations around the world, the most marginalized are the poor. On our side of the house, we stand to make that problem go away. We want to fix that problem, whereas they simply want to propose that there are other ways to fix it, and that we do not do anything. In my speech, we feel, during this round, we feel that there's two main points of clash. The first is, do the poor actually need to be helped? And the second is, does this actually help the poor? We feel that if we can prove both of these on our side of the house, we should win this debate. So in my speech today, first I'm going to be going into the themes of how these two different themes and refuting through those themes. And then I'm going to be talking about how they haven't actually touched any of our constructive points. They've barely refuted anything at all, and I'm going to be going through why those still stand and why those matter in those themes. But before I go into that, I would like to point out that as this is world style, really they should have pushed a case. They should have explained that if they don't like our way, our model, they should have at least explained what they would have done, what would work better, what will solve the problem. They don't actually do that. No thank you. Okay, so now on to themes. So my first theme was, do the poor need to be helped? Now, in the very first speeches, no thank you. They almost fully conceded that the poor do need to be helped. But nonetheless, I'll go into some of the points that we brought up. So first we said that the lottery of birth has made the poor very, very poor, and it's not anything they could have done based on how they were born and where they were born. Then we brought up the multiple examples of how the top 1% of the population worldwide own more wealth than the bottom 50%. That means all that wealth concentrated right up at the top. And my partners have very, very accurately explained why that is, how that system has been built to keep that wealth there, how that system has been built to make sure that 50% never get out of there. No thank you. Okay, so what else did we say on that point? So they kept telling us that, in the status quo, those that can't live, they already don't pay taxes. So first off, if that was true, if what they said was true, that those that simply cannot live, those that are struggling, they already don't pay taxes, then first off, we wouldn't have a poor in the same way, because those people would be paid an adequate amount. We wouldn't really be having this discussion at all. But we also provided you statistical analysis of the fact that there's a $17,000 difference between the current minimum standard of living, the minimum standard of living, not the average, not the good standard of living, the very minimum of which the government thinks someone can survive. There's a $17,000 gap between that and the average salary of the poor, and that salary that in the status quo already don't have to pay taxes. So that's why we do see that there is a massive problem. Then they told us that, the tax system does go to parks and roads, but they never explained how upgrading a highway will actually end up helping directly a poor person, how that will get them out of that lower wage bracket, how that will actually help them in the long run by building a road.
we don't see how they explain that. So they completely explain that they basically waste taxes on their side of the house.
Sir,
Sure.
do you not understand that poor communities aren't given random highways? They get what they need. Governments don't just blindly put highways because it's fun. We give them what they need in those communities.
They give them what the government thinks they need, and in a lot of cases, as my partners have explained, the government is very self-interested. In a lot of cases, even those that you would say are the most, no thank you, even those that you could argue are the most democratic governments still have human nature in them. That means that they want to profit for themselves. That is the nature of humans, and that is the case that we find. So even if you'd like to argue that they give them what they need, we see that the people, as my partner had already explained, the people know what they want. The people know what they need. So there is no reason to take money from the people and not give it back to them, not allow them to do what they want, not give them that self-determination when they're already in such a bad position because of the corrupt government system that has been built on their side of the house. No, thank you. Okay, so now since they partially conceded that the poor already need to be helped, we already won half of the debate. We already won the half of the debate that says that there is a problem and that they haven't addressed it. They haven't given us an alternative case. They haven't given us an alternative solution. So because of that, we clearly win this first theme. No, thank you. So now onto my second theme. Does this actually benefit the poor? Because we need to prove that this is effective. We need to prove that this works. And that is something we have very, very clearly done on our side of the house. On our side of the house, we told you how all the money goes to the rich. And when you can break that cycle of poverty, when you can break that cycle that has been built by the rich in order to make sure that the poor never get out of that status, when you break the cycle of poverty that says that because they can't feed their children, because they simply cannot put enough food on the table, because they're paying taxes for every dollar they earn, we see that because of that, when they are able to put food on the table, they're able to give their kids a better education. It has been statistically analyzed that kids that are fed, kids that are not malnourished, actually end up doing better in school. And when those kids do better in school, as my partner very, very accurately explained, when those kids do better at school, they're able to go to university, and they get that higher level of education that my partner explained is necessary to enter the higher parts of the workforce and to get out of that lower class. So we see that on our side of the house, we've explained how giving them more money for them to determine what they want to do with it actually does help them just by doing education. Sure.
So how do you think that by not paying tax, the very same injustices that your government imposes on people will not be done still? If a corrupt government is there, the government will be corrupt regardless.
Yes, and in those situations, that is when you eventually have to take government down. That's when you have to vote against that government. But in the meantime, we cannot allow these people to starve. We cannot allow these people to die. And if that government is willing to not make them pay taxes, which we on our side of the house have very, very accurately proved how that will actually improve their quality of living, we see that because you guys have proposed no countermodel as to how that government that you say is corrupt will actually fix things. So because of the fact that on our side of the house, we very, very clearly proved that this will actually help them, and this will help them both in the long run and now. This is why that we see that we win this point. But that is not the only reason that we win this point. Because let's look at the other points of clash. Well, they said that the economy is needed to be boosted by tax. That was what their second speaker gave us. She gave us that if we take the tax that the poor people pay, if we take that away from the system, then all of a sudden the system collapses and they can no longer give back to the poor. And because of that, the poor somehow will then actually be in a worse scenario. So first off, a major point of contradiction. They said earlier that the poor actually don't pay a lot of tax in the status quo, and that it's fairly irrelevant. But then they seem to think that if they don't pay that irrelevant amount of taxes on their side of the house, then that will make the system collapse. But not just that. We see that there are many, many other alternative sources to which the government can pull that money in order to pay for those social services. So we see that if, for example, the United States government paid, 45% of their GDP on the military instead of the full 50%, we see that 5% can be better allocated to social services. So because of that, we see that it's extremely important that we do other things like that. Now, let's look at the main reason that side opposition has told us that we cannot actually do this. They told us that it'll lower social services, that in the long run it may end up helping the poor, hurting the poor. But we see that it's shame on them for not realizing that these people who are in incredible amount of need, these people need that money, these people need that ability to live. So shame on them for telling us that we cannot give them that money because of the fact that we need to pay for social services. They can see that majority of that money that goes into social services goes into things like roads and parks. And we've told you very, very clearly on our side of the house how the money that we give, the money that we keep from going into their tax program, the money that we give to these people will then go into education, will then help these people in order to get a better education, in order to get a better life. So that will break the cycle of poverty. So shame on them for telling us we cannot do that. And so because of the fact that we very, very clearly outlined the problem, that the poor do need to be helped, and they conceded that they really have no alternative, they really have no countermodel. So because of that, we win that theme. On the second theme, does this benefit the poor? We very, very accurately portrayed for you how we benefit the poor and how they simply spend money on roads and parks. So for those reasons, we are very proud to propose.
May proceed.
So if proposition, no, hold up, I'm sorry, it's not. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So if proposition would like to believe that they realistically uplift the poor, let's look at the logic of their case. 3 important premises. 1, tax is essential to an economy. 2, tax obligates governments to respond to you. 3, poor people are marginalized. 3, general truth. When you apply logic, let's imagine what happens to marginalized people who no longer pay something that obliges the government to respond to them. If you say government feels very little obligation to them right now, imagine when they don't contribute to the efficiency of that government. Imagine the perception you set of them when they just become people who mooch off of infrastructure and don't give back to their economy. Their model perpetually harms poor people, especially if we're going to take it like they want to take it on their grounds. If we're really going to put it in places like they want to put it, all you do is perpetuate the harm posted to the individuals they feel are very important, right? So we're going to be evaluating this debate on two important questions. Firstly, who best empowers the poor? Secondly, whether or not this is legitimate. They paid very little money for this, right? But before that, 4 main strategic errors. So firstly, the false contradiction in third speech, right? So what he tells us is that we told you that they pay a low tax, but somehow we take a huge chunk out of the economy. One, we think that firstly he just left out the logic behind that, right? What we told you is that the debate stretches beyond Canada and America, where people happen to live above the breadline in Africa. We told you in those places where the poor are the majority, their little tax adds up to a lot of tax that is needed for those areas. We told them South Africa where 75% of the population just barely makes it above the breadline. We need their tax because when we lose 75% of our revenue, what happens to a country? That tax is important. It's not a contradiction. Listen to logic. Second strategic error. They tell us that there's the systematic oppression that happens there because there's a corrupt government. When they firstly don't directly attribute this to it being a fault of poor people paying tax. Because what we told you is that this is a fault of a corrupt government, not a fault of people paying tax. They didn't attribute their harm. They didn't attach it to that, right? But moreover, right, we think that because it's systematic, that means it's intrinsic to a system. What that literally means is that you don't get any better the point at which you don't allow poor people to pay tax. Because if it's intrinsic to that system, what happens that the next thing is that what's likely to happen is that the lower middle class are the next lower class who are marginalized. Because if it's so intrinsic to a system, we don't root it by fighting problems that are the direct cause. But furthermore, right, we think that what you do is you further perpetuate the harm posed to poor people because now government has even less of an obligation to actually try and improve their lives because they know that they themselves don't give back to that government. Second thing, right? Second strategic error. What they tell us that rich people control a majority of the wealth and they're really bad to poor people and perpetuate their poverty. When again, right, they don't show us how they realistically fix this. Because when you apply logic, rich people own businesses, money will go back to businesses whether or not you pay tax. So under their model, they don't really fix anything. But furthermore, again, still harm poor people because what you then do is you give an excuse for the rich to be even worse to them, right? But then the third strategic error is when they just give us a model that's status quo. Right? So they tell us that those who live below the breadline aren't going. Those who live below the breadline aren't going to be paying tax, right? We tell you that thing is status quo. So if you cannot afford your basic necessities, you don't pay tax. Canada is not an example that we should be using here. You are you are part of the leader of the first world. We need to be looking at countries like Zimbabwe, countries like Zambia, countries where poverty is a norm and having 22,000 is a dream. Those are the places we need to look at. You can't just tell us that there's a $17,000 disparity, so it's really bad. We told that in those areas, if anything, government has a better ability to provide for those people, right? Your people, your government generally has more capital to provide for them. We need to be looking at we need to be looking at like entirely different places as opposed to the kind that they want to live in under their model, right? So we tell you essentially all they really do is status quo. So here we need to evaluate. Now, like here we need to question why do they really want a counter mechanism when that's really our job? We're supposed to tell you to fight for status quo. That is what we chose. Again, they try and make us propose a counter model to status quo. That's their job, right? But then we need to look at the actual issues in this debate. One, who best empowers the poor? Go ahead.
Why are your alternatives that you propose about social services mutually exclusive to our mechanism when I specifically
So you didn't listen to me when I told you that governments have a diluted obligation to them. Governments directly give back to the people who give back to them. That is the virtue of the social contract that exists. We give to you, you give to us. The point at which you don't give to a government, they have a very diluted obligation towards you and are less likely to do that. But furthermore, if they're really as marginalized as you'd like to make them seem, that obligation that you argue is already so diluted becomes practically non-existent. Great. Now let's get back to the question. Who best empowers the poor, right? So essentially what proposition tells you under this are three things. They tell you that firstly, they best empower the poor because when they keep money to themselves, they can adequately sustain themselves. Secondly, they tell us that government doesn't do anything and they focus their money on other things that are not intrinsic to their life. But furthermore, they tell us that the wealth stays at the top, so they best help poor people, right? Great. Let's deal with this first argument. How when they keep money to themselves, they're better able to sustain themselves. Three responses. We told you that firstly, right? We need to recognize what government does for these people. Because what government does is not something that individuals in their own capacity have access to. So what government does is it installs pipes so people can get clean water. If you really want to play us on South African grounds, we tell you that our tax went to providing sanitation for the townships in Cape Town, right? We tell you that things like that are not things that the people in those communities can be doing themselves, right? So by virtue of that, government uses that capital in a way that's efficient for them that they can't do themselves. We tell that food doesn't matter if you're surrounded by diseases. We tell you that we first need to make sure that you're going to survive after you eat that in the first place, right? So we do that purely because of that, their idea is untrue. Furthermore, secondly, we need to again understand who we are talking about. Because they want to make the sound like we're talking about the people who can barely scrape enough money for a loaf of bread. This is not true. We're talking about people who can afford their basic necessities as determined by that government. And then people who can afford tax beyond that, we recognize that those are the sorts of people who we make pay tax. We don't make you pay tax if you can't afford a loaf of bread, if you can't afford non-tax products, right? But then thirdly, right, we tell you that this debate stretches beyond just the free world, right? We tell you that this wealth gap that they tell you about is very important to recognize the nuances and how it was developed. No. So we tell you that something like this wealth gap, right, as said by their first speaker, was an aggregate. What does an aggregate mean? It means we take everyone there and we divide it by we take the income of everyone there, divide it and reach an average. What that means is that it's not an efficient representation of what people need in that area to live, right? Because if you tell us that it's an aggregate that we use to determine whether or not 22,000 in Canada is necessary, then we tell you that in and of itself is not an adequate representation of what they need. Secondly, right, they tell us that government focuses too heavily on the military. Two responses. We tell you that firstly, that's just untrue and purely America's fault. We tell you that in instance for South Africa, they give out a very high amount of funds, but furthermore, they have the largest educational budget. Beyond that, we give out RDPs to those poor people who give out that tax. But secondly, we tell you that also is a fault of a very bad government. We don't think a government should prioritize military above social services anyway. It's not a fault of poor people paying tax. But thirdly, they tell us that the wealth stays at the top. So three responses. Firstly, we tell you that this wealth trickles down. It will always reach the people on the ground. Secondly, right, we tell you that they don't fix that either because they're in business. Their wealth is still perpetuated. Furthermore, right, we tell you that you incentivize them to treat them even worse. But so we think that essentially because of that, they don't empower the poor. But furthermore, by virtue of the legitimate principle of reciprocity, they still harm the poor. Their principle doesn't work for them either. Opposition wins the debate.
I will now invite the second speaker. Yes, second speaker from the opposition. Listen to the reply.
Here.
I apologize for me. I don't want to embarrass you.
Ladies and gentlemen, not only did side proposition fail to actually give us a difference between the current status quo that actually has tax brackets and their system or rather mechanism that they are actually imposing. Not only do they lose on that point, but they actually lose on three major points. One, which is that of efficacy. Secondly, which is legitimacy. But lastly, which is that of necessity. Now let's look back at these four categories that we actually identified in this debate. So what we told you here was that it's actually very effective when we actually implement a consistent principle of when we of giving an example where we actually tell you that when you give to the government, then the government is obligated to give back to you. Now this is something that they actually failed to do here, right? And actually understand here. We tell you here that when people protest against the government, they protest because they realize that they have given something, yet they have failed to receive. But what happens when people stop to actually give to the government? Then the power that they actually have to go and demand to government does not exist in that instance because government has no obligation to do that, right? So we tell you, moreover, that their mechanism is not even effective in this instance because according to the social contract that actually exists, right, it actually causes backlash. So what happens when you only have 25% of rich people in a society? We tell you that those individuals are actually less likely to retaliate in that instance because they're only actually doing the job of a 75% majority, which is almost impossible in this instance. Ladies and gentlemen, under the point of efficacy, they lose this by simply not understanding that logic, and therefore we take that point. Now let's look at the point of necessity here, right? So this is where we actually got to a concession, right? Where we said that people actually need to be helped because they are poor in societies, right? So what we needed to understand here, which is the most important thing, which is that of economical stability that needs to be maintained to actually determine the life of people in society, to be able to live the righteous life that they actually determined to actually propose to the House today. What we tell you here is that when 75% is actually below the red line, right, and you actually tell us that, well, they shouldn't give back to government, right, what we tell you here is that this is very flawed because the little that they actually do give, they actually contributes to a larger social capital than the narrow one that they actually do have in order for government to be able to actually give back to them on a larger scale, right? But moreover, what we tell you here, that the 25% of the rich people that will be paying tax in countries like Zimbabwe, in countries like South Africa, in all the other countries that do not have the social capital like Canada and America will not be able to actually sustain their lives. And what happens when an economy actually drops, right? We tell you here that when an economy drops, it is the obligation of the government to ensure that the status of the economy is then kept sustained, right? So what happens here when we do not have the 75% of the little tax that we get from the people to maintain that economy? What we tell you here, that government is forced to actually raise the rates in order for them to actually stabilize the economy, right? Which all makes it almost impossible in that country for the very same people that they're actually proposing for to actually meet up to those levels. And we see that that is actually very unstable, right? And we do not buy that argument. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, by virtue of not understanding that need, they lose that debate because of the logical understanding that they actually missed here. Now let's look at the point of legitimacy. So ladies and gentlemen, basically in this debate, if we can prove that while the system can be solved without necessarily eradicating tax, then we win this debate. We got two things here, right? One, they told us that the system is rigged, but secondly, they told us that taxes are actually given to the upper classes. What we told you here as a response was that one, that problem is not only exclusive to taxes in this instance, which is something that they actually failed to prove, but even if it is, with our mechanism, right, when such an injustice is actually imposed on people, the people have a power to retaliate simply because they pay tax. We value that kind of voice. We tell you here that for the fact that grants are actually given in South Africa, houses are being given in South Africa, and for the fact that the corporate social environment actually give back to society is because of the social contract that we say people have a voice when they pay tax. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm still proud to be folks.
Finally, I will now invite the first speaker of the government to deliver their reply speech and close this debate.
Ready? Thank you. I want to start this speech with three very specific and distinct clarifications before I go on to two themes as to why government sides won this debate. I want to firstly talk about, this is the themes, the benefits to the poor, and second of all, the alternatives. Let's begin with the three clarifications. First off, their entire case was very inconsistent. The first speaker stands up and supposedly has a very inconsistent stance where they support things like social services. But then down the bench, for number 2 and 3, they said they support the status quo. But then they accused us of supporting the status quo, right? So like, what are you guys advocating for? Your case is inconsistent. That's an automatic loss. Second of all, they lost strategically, right? That is to say, most of their constructive and the crux of their case came out in their second and third speaker, where we refuted their first, right? Also for the fact that they brought up new info in their reply speech. Look at your notes. Third thing they lost on is the premise that when poor people can make demands, right? We gave you structural reasons on our side of the house as to why those demands aren't met because of the self-interest of politicians. That flies in the face of the entire crux of their case and something that they never properly engaged with. Those clarifications are done. Let's move on to themes. First off, I want to talk to you about what benefits the poor, right? Because the crux of their case is here. They say, look, now the poor are going to be seen as mooching off the government. Now the poor can't get their demands met because they won't be taxed. We gave you structural reasons as to why they don't get their demands met in the status quo. So even if we swallow that harm, at least we get tangible on-the-ground benefits on our side of the house, right? That is to say, people feeding themselves in Africa. That is to say, people having the amount of sanitary measures to not get the diseases that these guys want to talk about, right? So at least you get tangible on-the-ground benefits on our side of the house. But I also think that Michael does a really good job of mitigating this point, talking about why it still exists under the status quo, something that they never engage with in their third or the response. So I think we win on that. But moreover, what did we tell you? We told you how there are structural reasons as to why these poor people can't get the change that these guys want to talk about, and they never properly engaged with that. What did we tell you? We told you first off how they're self-interested, how there's a police state that persecutes the minority, that is to say, the poor, and we've also showed you how they aren't politically enfranchised. So as long as these guys can't prove to you why they're not politically enfranchised, they lose this debate. Let's talk about alternatives. And I think that this is really where the crux of their case lies, right? Because they say, look, we support social services and we support other mechanisms in making sure that the poor are well-fed, are well-dressed, etc. First off, and we questioned them in the first speech on our side of the house in preempting. Why does there necessarily have to be a trade-off between not taxing the poor and giving those social services to the poor? They never explain that up and down their case, and that's why they lose this debate. Because we've questioned them from the first speaker all the way to the reply as to why these mechanisms are necessarily and inherently mutually exclusive. And this is very important because that's what their case lies on. They say that social services are mutually exclusive because now, like, you can use those funds to make social services. We gave you analysis as to why you can take that military budget or useless budget and put it into social services so that the quality of those social services don't deteriorate. That's our stance, not their stance, and that's an inconsistency on their side of the house. What did we tell you then? We told you that it's not a choice, and we told you that the poor people in the status quo are systematically oppressed because of the government, because of the rich people having all the power. They never responded to this, and they never gave you an adequate mechanism as to why their side of the house doesn't matter if they can see that the status quo isn't working for poor people in Africa. This debate comes down to two questions then. Number one, which side better helps the poor people? We've refuted the crux of their case about how it's going to mooch off, like they're going to mooch off the government, that therefore they can't get the adequate demands met. We told you why those are intangible, why our impacts are tangible on-the-ground impacts that affect the very disenfranchised. But second of all, we've proven to you why their mechanism and their counterbalance is absolutely ridiculous and inconsistent with their entire case. We're very proud to propose.